Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. This is an in-depth series on the history of the Christian faith. In this video, we'll be examining aspects of the church in the Middle Ages, with a particular focus on church architecture and church polity. We'll then go on to look at the period known as the Crusades. We'll conclude with a focus on the life of Raymond Lull, and Raymond offered a different approach to Muslims in contrast to that shown by the Crusaders. Raymond focused on loving engagement with Muslims. Now we're just going to move away from historical events for a moment and look at the church of the Middle Ages in light of things such as church buildings. Norman architecture was a development of Romanesque architecture of Western Europe in England, so sometimes it's called English Romanesque architecture. It was introduced by the Normans from Normandy in France after they conquered England in the year 1066. Romanesque churches tended to be more simpler and more squat in appearance than later Gothic churches. You can see here a small squat tower in this picture. They also had fewer and smaller windows when compared with the later Gothic style, and this gave them an overall heavy appearance. English Romanesque or Norman style churches were also more solid and austere in appearance. As well as being more squat than later Gothic buildings, they also did not have the Gothic spires. Romanesque churches also had rounded arch windows. Decorative rounded arches were also found surrounding doorways. Arches could also be found in the interior of these buildings. Note too the massive piers in this example. Large piers or columns and massive walls were needed to hold the weight of the roofs of Romanesque cathedrals. Now, this was because roofs were being made of stone, whereas previously the roofs of basilicas had been made of timber. Thicker walls also meant that there was less window space and therefore less light in the interior. So often candles were being used to illuminate the interior of these massive buildings. Romanesque buildings also had what is called a barrel vaulted style, as you can see in this particular example, whereas in the earlier basilicas they were flat ceilings. Barrel vaulted ceilings were later replaced by groined vaulted ceilings, such as seen in this particular example. Winchester Cathedral in England was built in the late 11th century. It was originally built in the Norman style, and note the small squat tower, but later modifications were made in the Gothic style. Winchester Cathedral was at one time one of the largest cathedrals in the world, and at 170 metres it was definitely the longest. Gothic architecture evolved from Romanesque. The Gothic style flourished between the 12th to the 16th centuries, and we'll look at this style a little later. What about church hierarchy or church structure? We're going to focus here on the Roman Church or the Church of the West. The church in Rome was an established hierarchy with the Bishop of Rome given the title of Papa, meaning father, and what we know today as Pope. The Pope was the supreme leader of the church. Underneath the Pope in terms of authority were the cardinals, and from the year 1059 onwards they had the role of electing the Pope. These cardinals were usually bishops, but some came from the ranks of the priests and deacons, and cardinals were chosen by the Pope. Beneath them were the archbishops, who were the chief bishops of a province, and these provinces were called an archdiocese. Then there were bishops who presided over a principal city and the surrounding area, and this was called a diocese. The word diocese comes from the Greek word meaning administration. A diocese was also simply called a see, which came from the Latin word meaning a seat. The church in which the bishop presided had a cathedra, which is the Greek word for seat, and this made the church a cathedral. As mentioned, the Catholic Church held to an idea of apostolic succession. This was the idea that the ministry of the church was held to be derived from the apostles by a continuous succession. And this succession is seen symbolically through bishops consecrating other bishops through the laying on of hands. This series was originally understood as beginning with bishops of a particular see to be founded by one or more of the apostles. Then beneath the bishops were the priests, and they were in charge of a local church, and the local church area was called a parish, and priests were appointed by bishops. The main duties of a parish priest was to hear confession and to celebrate the Mass. Entry into the priesthood was regarded as a sacrament, and priests had to remain celibate. Priests in parish ministry were known as secular clergy, but their standards of education and commitment varied widely across Europe. There were also the deacons. The deacons had a variety of tasks which included assisting the priest during the Mass. He could, for example, distribute the bread or give certain blessings during the service. And they were also permitted on occasions to preach a sermon or a homily. One of the major differences to the priest was that deacons were allowed to marry. We can see from this information how the role of the presbyter or elder has changed since the first century. There's not only a name change from presbyter to priest, and as well a role change to that of an intermediary with God, but there's also a change in polity or church structure. Now an individual church is presided over by a single person, that of a priest, rather than by a group of elders, and this reflects the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church. The role of the deacon has also changed, from initially being tasked with the role of assisting the poor and the needy, to now having more of a liturgical role. In addition to members mentioned in the list under church hierarchy, there were also two important types of orders. These were the monastic order and the mendicant order. The monastic orders were based around monasteries. Larger monasteries with more members were called abbeys. The heads of the abbeys were called abbots, or in the case of a nunnery, an abbess. Smaller monasteries were called priories, and their heads were known as a prior, and the female head as a prioress. Abbeys or monasteries were made up of members called monks or nuns, and of course each was separated on the basis of female and male monasteries. Now, abbots, the leaders of monasteries, could also be very influential in the wider church, and there were some members of monasteries who were ordained, and they were called regular clergy. The mendicant orders came a little later. They were led by friars. Now, friars weren't monks in the true understanding of the word, although they did submit to the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The friars were mendicant or travelling and begging monks. They didn't live in monasteries but in friaries which were situated amongst the laity. They would preach, teach, and hear confession. We'll come to look at the major orders of the friars, and they included the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Augustinians, and the Carmelites. We now come to a disturbing historical period in the Catholic Church known as the Crusades. The events of the Crusades have had a lasting impact which continues to the present. Throughout the 11th century, the Muslim Seljuk Turks expanded their territory increasingly westward, drawing closer and closer to the capital of the Byzantine Empire, that of Constantinople. As the Seljuk Turks increased in power, they became a threat to the Eastern Emperor, Alexius Comnenus. In the year 1071, the Seljuk Turks took Jerusalem. They had taken it over from the Egyptian Fatimids. Prior to this, though, one of the Fatimid leaders, called Hakim, had destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the year 1009, along with other churches. Despite this being an aberration of Muslim-Christian relations, the Western Church remembered this event. The Seljuks, although tolerant of the local Christian population, refused to allow pilgrims to visit the so-called Holy Land. The Seljuks also invaded Asia Minor, and there they'd also destroyed some churches, although many Christians continued to worship freely. And now the Seljuk Turks were threatening Constantinople itself. In the year 1095, Alexius appealed to the Western Church for help, claiming that atrocities were being committed on Christian pilgrims in Israel. Yet this may not have been the case. Alexius may have had political motives, seeking help from the West in order to defend his kingdom from the Seljuk Turks. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II called for a crusade to retake the Holy Land. He told those gathered at Clermont in southern France about these alleged atrocities being made on Christians, and said to those there,
"They have circumcised the Christians, either spreading the blood from the circumcisions on the altars, or pouring it into the baptismal fonts, and they cut open the navels of those whom they choose to torment with a loathsome death, tear out their most vital organs, and tie them to a stake, drag them around and flog them, before killing them as they lie prone on the ground, with all their entrails out. They tie some to posts and shoot at them with arrows. They order others to bare their necks, and they attack them with drawn swords, trying to see if they can cut off their heads with a single stroke."
Now, Pope Urban was reporting what was happening in Palestine based on what he had been told by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus. And this information was grossly exaggerated. Pope Urban continued his message with a call to arms.
Until now, you have fought unjust wars. You have often savagely brandished your spears at each other in mutual carnage only out of greed and pride, for which you deserve eternal destruction and the certain ruin of damnation. Now, we are proposing that you should fight wars which contain the glorious reward of martyrdom, in which you can gain the title of present and eternal glory.
So here, Urban is advocating a form of Christian jihad. And the result of his sermon? There was an enthusiastic response. And apparently the people cried, Deus vult, or God wills it. It's probably important to note that the Crusades were not a single event. There were actually 8 official crusades that took place over more than 170 years. There was also an unofficial crusade, and it is known today as the People's Crusade. Following Urban II's call for a crusade to the Holy Land, throughout Europe, papal representatives went across the lands seeking recruits. There were many incentives placed on those seeking to join, and we've mentioned one, which is the indulgence guaranteeing their entry to heaven or reduced time in purgatory. Now, why did people join up? Well, the motives were very mixed. Many joined up not because of any spiritual gain, they were just interested in the adventure. The hastily organised People's Crusade was inspired by Peter the Hermit. They were an inexperienced group, they were ill-led and not well organised, attacking Jews as they crossed Europe, and massacres took place in which thousands of Jewish people were killed and synagogues were destroyed. They travelled overland through the areas of Eastern Europe. Now, while many in their number were peasants and included women and children, there were some low-ranking knights, and they were made up of both the French and the Germans. They arrived at the walls of Constantinople, and a concerned Emperor Comnenus hastily sent this ragtag group over the Bosphorus Strait into Asia Minor. Knights, women and children now focused on the Muslim-controlled city of Nicaea, which is south of Constantinople. They split into groups along national lines, and the French soldiers concentrated on taking Nicaea. In the process, they attacked people in the regions around, which were predominantly Eastern Orthodox Christians, or at least breakaway sects from Eastern Orthodox. Perhaps they were monophysites. Many of these Christians were living under Turkish control and had freedom of worship, and it would appear that Crusaders did not know, or more accurately weren't willing to acknowledge, that these people that they were killing were in fact fellow Christians. The other group took the castle of Xerigordos. However, the Turkish forces led by King Arslan surrounded the castle and cut off the water supply, which was outside the city walls. It took 8 days for the city to fall to the Turks. Some of the Crusaders converted to Islam, while others who refused were killed. King Arslan then spread the rumour that Nicaea had been taken by the other group of Crusaders, and so many other French troops still in the region headed off to the city, walking straight into Arslan's trap. They were massacred, and the People's Crusade was wiped out. Most of the Crusaders were slaughtered, upwards of 60,000 by some accounts. However, women, children, and those who surrendered were spared. 3,000 were able to obtain refuge in an abandoned castle. And the leader, Peter the Hermit, meanwhile, had returned to Constantinople and was joined by a small remnant that had survived. The next crusade was more officially organised, and it's called the First Crusade. It consisted of trained men, and they were led by papal representatives such as the Bishop Adhemar, who was the Bishop of Pi. The First Crusade set out in the year 1096. This group consisted of trained, mostly French and Norman troops, along with German knights and Italians, and there were perhaps about 30 to 35,000 men. Some others have suggested that there were more than this. And this group included cavalry. There were also many pilgrims who joined them, both men and women. They left in 5 different groups and arrived at Constantinople at different times. One of these groups were led by brothers Godfrey and Baldwin of Boulogne, which is in Flanders in northern France, and they arrived with their troops. It would be Godfrey who would eventually become the unofficial leader of this crusade. As these groups arrived separately at Constantinople, Emperor Comnenus made them all swear an oath of loyalty before they were quickly taken over the Bosphorus. The year was now 1097, and the Crusaders set off to besiege Nicaea. Emperor Alexius Comnenus did not send any troops, but he did send 2 generals to assist them. The Turkish king Arslan set off to stop them. Arslan was forced to retreat, so the Crusaders set up a siege, but without proper siege weapons, so a 6-week stalemate went by. Emperor Alexius then intervened because he regarded the city as belonging to himself, as most of its population were Greek. So a secret deal was done with the Turkish leaders to hand the city over to Alexius instead of the unpredictable Crusaders. So in June 1097, the Crusaders woke to see the Byzantine emperor's flag flying over the city. Meanwhile, King Arslan had formed an alliance with another ruler, and so now brought a combined force to Dorylaeum, which was approximately 100 kilometres south of Nicaea. The Crusaders were now joined by some Byzantine soldiers, but not a large army. The Turkish Seljuk forces were defeated, but the Crusaders also suffered many casualties. However, the Seljuks never troubled them again. The Crusaders were not happy because they wanted the so-called sacred right to plunder the city's wealth. But they couldn't because, like Nicaea, Dorylaeum originally belonged to the Byzantines, although the emperor did compensate the Crusaders financially. The Crusaders then crossed Asia Minor. It was the height of summer, and in the August sun the people suffered greatly, with men and women and children dying of thirst and of the heat. Arriving at Tyana, the Crusader forces divided. Some feared travelling south to Tarsus, as they thought that they would be vulnerable to attack, as they had to go through the narrow pass known as the Cilician Gates. One group travelled north through the Christian territory of Cappadocia, and although they were Christian, they were not loyal to Byzantium. However, Baldwin and Tancred took their forces south, through the Cilician Gates, and they took Tarsus after being advised that the citizens there had had enough of the Turks and would surrender. After the taking of the city, Baldwin demanded and received ownership of it. The two Crusader forces then rejoined at the city of Morash, but subsequently divided again into two groups. The larger group, led by Godfrey of Boulogne, set off for Jerusalem and travelled south, arriving at the city of Antioch. The other was led by his brother Baldwin, and they set off to the east, to the city of Edessa. Godfrey and his men soon arrived at the city of Antioch. Antioch was a significant Christian city in one of the four patriarchies. Godfrey and his men then put Antioch under siege. The siege lasted for 9 months. Many of the Crusaders died during the siege due to famine, while others deserted. However, a Muslim guard succumbed to bribery and opened the gate, and so in 1098, Antioch fell into Crusader hands. But unfortunately, the city had been starved dry, and now the victorious Crusaders had a difficult time with a lack of food. Then a large Muslim force arrived and began to besiege the Crusaders, who were now in the fortress of Antioch. In a state of hunger, some of the Crusaders resorted to cannibalism. There is a quote which said, "Our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled." Then a certain poor monk, Peter Bartholomew, claimed that he'd had a vision of St. Andrew, who told him that the Holy Lance, the one that pierced Jesus' side, was to be found under the floor of a church of St. Peter in Antioch. The church floor was searched and a lance was discovered. After being inspired by this alleged miraculous finding of the Holy Lance, the Crusaders, now led by Count Raymond, attacked and defeated the besieging Muslim forces. They then once again set off for Jerusalem. Baldwin, of course, had headed off towards the Christian city of Edessa. It was ruled by King Thoros, but was surrounded by Seljuk Turks. The people of Edessa opened the gates to the Crusaders in March of 1098. While there, Baldwin had an unusual ceremony in which Thoros and his wife, both naked, along with a naked Baldwin, formed a circle with Baldwin in the middle to formally adopt Baldwin as their son. When Thoros was suddenly murdered by an unruly mob 4 weeks later, Baldwin conveniently became the sole heir of Edessa. Godfrey, meanwhile, joined his brother at Edessa. The group that had been involved in the siege of Antioch were now led by Count Raymond. They travelled south to Acre and eventually were joined by the group by Godfrey, who'd left Edessa, but his brother Baldwin stayed on for a while and then rejoined the Crusaders later, once Jerusalem had been retaken. Meanwhile, in early 1099, Jerusalem was retaken from the Seljuks by the Fatimids from Egypt. Apart from the ruler Hakim of Egypt, they, as Muslim rulers, had generally been more tolerant to the Christians in the past. Shortly after this, there was a squabble of leadership among the Crusaders, and there was a challenge regarding the authenticity of Peter Bartholomew's vision and of the Holy Lance. Peter took up the challenge, and to prove himself, he ran through some flames, but died as a result of his injuries 13 days later. The Crusaders then abandoned the siege at Acre and marched on to Tripoli, and then to Jerusalem. Finally, in June 1099, the Crusaders, now numbering perhaps around 40,000, although some say there was as little as 12,000, arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem. The group not only consisted of soldiers, but also ordinary men and women who had come along as pilgrims. After a short siege on the 15th of July, the Crusaders scaled the walls and the city surrendered. But then the Crusaders began to massacre a large number of Muslims and Jews. Many Muslims fled to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the Temple Mount, where they were promised safety by the Crusader leader Tancred. However, the promise wasn't honoured and the massacre continued, and by next morning the Al-Aqsa was knee-deep in blood and corpses, according to records of the time. It's estimated that around 70,000 were killed in the conquering of Jerusalem by the Crusaders. On the 22nd of July, a council was held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Raymond of Toulouse had been asked to become king of Jerusalem, but he refused, and so Godfrey agreed to become ruler. Godfrey refused to be crowned king, saying that he would never wear a crown of gold where his saviour had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he preferred to be called protector of the Holy Sepulchre. However, upon his death in July 1100, his brother Baldwin succeeded him, and he took on the title King of Jerusalem. There is still a lot of evidence of the Crusader impact on Jerusalem in the buildings there today. Now that the Crusaders occupied a large territory across the Levant, they had to divide into 4 Crusader states in order to administer them properly. These states were the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. The other principality seen here on the map is that of the Armenian Principality of Cilicia. This was formed by Armenian refugees who had fled the Seljuk invasion of their territory of Armenia in the region of eastern Turkey. You'll also note from this map that the Seljuks were by no means defeated. They still controlled vast areas of modern-day Turkey and Mesopotamia. After the Christian armies had captured Jerusalem from Muslim control, groups of pilgrims from across Western Europe began visiting the Holy Land. However, many of them were robbed and killed as they crossed through Muslim-controlled territories during their journey. So around the year 1118, a French knight created a military order along with 8 relatives and acquaintances, calling it the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, known later simply as the Knights Templar. And so the Knights Templar carried out an important mission to protect these pilgrims visiting the sites, but they also carried out military operations. They continue to be a powerful and a mysterious order that has fascinated historians and the public over the years. We've already noted attacks on the Jewish population by the Crusaders led by Peter the Hermit during the People's Crusade of 1096. This anti-Jewish sentiment continued prior to the First Crusade, and during this time it's thought that around 5,000 Jews were killed in Europe. There was evidence also that there was strong anti-Semitic sentiment that was held by some of the Crusade leaders. 40 years after the event, the Jewish historian Solomon Bar Simpson stated,
Godfrey had sworn to go on this journey only after avenging the blood of the crucified one by shedding Jewish blood and completely eradicating any trace of those bearing the name Jew, thus assuaging his own burning wrath.
Yet it has to be acknowledged that such atrocities against the Jews were not condoned by the Catholic Church. One example can be seen in the response the Church had to the massacres that took place during the First Crusade, when it's thought that so many had died. From the year 1120 onwards, Pope Calixtus II put out a series of papal bulls called Sicut Judaeus, meaning as the Jews. The first bull was essentially a papal charter of protection to the Jews. The bull forbade Christians, on the pain of excommunication, from harming them, from taking their property, from disturbing the celebration of their festivals, or interfering with their cemeteries, and from forcing Jews to convert to the Christian faith. Sadly, this did not end the persecution of the Jewish people. About 160 years later, in 1287, there were more massacres of the Jews after they were accused of causing the mysterious death of a young man by the name of Werner Oberwessel. He lived in the Rhine Valley. Initially, 500 Jews were killed as a result of these unsubstantiated allegations. Around the same time, other allegations were made against the Jews that they had desecrated the communion elements, or according to Catholic teaching, the Holy Host. Mobs attacked Jewish communities throughout the Rhine Valley and other parts of Germany, and it's thought that as many as 20,000 Jewish people were killed. In the year 1144, Edessa, one of the Crusader states, was retaken by Muslim forces by the Sultan of Aleppo, and so Jerusalem was once again under threat. Among those who called for a second crusade was Bernard of Clairvaux. He said,
God will award to those fighting for him wages, the remission of sins and everlasting glory.
Although Bernard did not want to see the Jews put to the sword as others, like Rudolf, a German monk, were advocating, because Rudolf claimed that the Jews were not contributing financially to the Crusades. As a result of Rudolf's influence, a number of further massacres took place in the Rhine Valley. Places such as Cologne, Mainz, Worms and Speyer all saw pogroms against the Jewish people. The Second Crusade began around 1147, when an army of perhaps as many as 200,000, although it's difficult to say precisely, were assembled. They were from two national groups. There were the Germans under King Conrad III, and the Franks, or the French, under the leadership of King Louis VII. The two armies met in Hungary sometime in mid-1147. Conrad's army numbered about 20,000 and they arrived at Constantinople first. They then crossed over into Asia, but suffered a heavy defeat by the Seljuk Turks at Dorylaeum, and only around 2,000 escaped to Nicaea. Many of his troops then deserted and returned home, but Conrad travelled to Acre via the sea. Meanwhile, Louis VII's French forces arrived at Constantinople and they too entered Asia. They were attacked by the Muslim forces near the ancient towns of Colossae and Laodicea, but they continued on and eventually laid siege to Damascus in 1148. Louis was joined by Conrad at Damascus. The siege was ultimately a failure for the French, and so Louis returned to France. Ultimately, the Second Crusade achieved little. Possibly the most significant thing about the Second Crusade was that a group of English, Flemish, and Frisian Crusaders who took to a sea route to Palestine. Almost incidentally, the city of Lisbon was taken from the Muslim Moors on the journey in 1147, and then a year later the Moors were again defeated at Tortosa. Many of the Crusaders stopped their journey and they settled in both of these cities. Despite the Crusader victories at Lisbon and Tortosa, the central and southern portions of the Iberian Peninsula remained under Muslim control. Now, by way of background material, it was in the year 711 that Muslims from North Africa had invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and this is the location of modern-day Spain and Portugal. And by the year 720, they controlled most of the peninsula, with the exception of a small strip of land in the north. And these Muslim rulers became known as the Moors. Even by the year 979, the Muslim Moors controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula, as can be seen here on this map, showing the area of control in green. In the year 1212, the Moors were defeated by the Spanish Catholic king at the Battle of Tolosa, and they were expelled from the central areas of the Iberian Peninsula. However, they continued to occupy the south in what was called the Kingdom of Granada. The Moors were eventually expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492 after another defeat in battle. There is still evidence of the Moorish rule across the Iberian Peninsula today. We now move ahead 40 years to 1182, when an incident called the Massacre of the Latins took place. The massacre occurred at Constantinople. The Latin or Roman Catholic merchants and their families, who at that time dominated the city's maritime trade and financial sector, were killed. The bulk of the Latin community, estimated at over 60,000 people at the time, was either wiped out or forced to flee. The Genoese and the Pisan communities especially were decimated, and some 4,000 survivors were sold as slaves to the Turks. A large number of Venetian merchants were also attacked and deported during this massacre. Why did this occur? Well, possibly as a baseline, there was jealousy at the wealth and the power that these Latin merchants were gaining in Greek Constantinople. The French or Frankish leader to emerge in this period was Raymond. Raymond is portrayed by some historians as an irresponsible adventurer who had a lust for booty. He became the Prince of Antioch around the year 1153 and eventually came to lead the Crusader forces against the Seljuks. Raynald was eventually killed at the Battle of Hattin, and it is said that he was beheaded personally by the Seljuk leader Saladin himself. Once in power, it would be wrong to think that the Crusaders perpetually punished Muslims. There's evidence that at least on a local level, Crusaders and Muslims got along. It was while travelling through northern Palestine in the year 1184 that the medieval Muslim scholar Ibn Jaybar described countless farming villages inhabited by Muslims who seemed, to him at least, to live in complete harmony with the Crusaders. He bemoaned the fact that these Muslims didn't even seem to be bothered by them mingling with what he described as Christian pigs and filth. It's perhaps not surprising that, generally speaking, some Crusaders and Muslims got along, as this was now over 80 years since the arrival of the first Crusaders, and they had long gone. While some would have been new arrivals, there would have been the descendants of the Crusaders who were now living in Palestine, and they knew nothing except of life there. Meanwhile, the Seljuks were now being led by Saladin. In the year 1187, a Muslim army of 30,000 under Saladin's leadership inflicted a heavy defeat on Christian forces at the Horns of Hattin in northern Israel. Saladin and his forces now marched southward towards Jerusalem. The city was surrounded and surrendered after 13 days. However, in contrast to the Crusaders, no massacres took place or any buildings were looted under the leadership of Saladin. As a response to the fall of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, a third crusade was organised. This crusade was led by men such as Richard the Lionheart of England, King Philip of France, and Frederick Barbarossa, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. This crusade also ended in failure, with Frederick drowning and Richard and Philip quarrelling and Philip returning to France. The Crusaders did retake the northern Israeli city of Akko or Acre, but essentially failed in their aims. As an aside here, the stories of Robin Hood and Richard's brother King John centre around events of this time. Within 10 years, a fourth crusade took place at the urging of Pope Innocent III in the year 1200. Now, the massacre of the Latins in Constantinople had caused great resentment against the Byzantines by the Catholic Church. So during this crusade, Constantinople was attacked and sacked by the Crusaders. A Roman patriarch was appointed, and the Greek Church made subject to Rome. Many relics were also plundered and taken to Rome. Ironically, the taking of documents was one of the factors that led to the rebirth of interest in Greek philosophy in the West and the era known as the Renaissance. Now, while the city of Constantinople was retaken by the Greeks in 1261, the act had scarred the relationship between the East and the West, and it's only been within recent years that it has been addressed. In the year 2001, Pope John Paul II, speaking in Athens, expressed his remorse for the actions that took place in the year 1204. But the actions of the Crusaders directly accelerated the collapse of Christendom in the East by weakening the Eastern Empire, and in the long run actually facilitated the expansion of Islam into Europe. There is the legendary story of the so-called Children's Crusade. Based in some truth, the crusade comprised thousands of mainly youths and young adults who set out from France and Germany to march to the Holy Land in the year 1212. Suffering with a lack of official church support and shortages of food on the way, they never left Europe, with many dying on the journey, and the remaining who gradually dispersed. Legendary stories emerged claiming that the group was made up of young children, and that many of these were eventually sold into slavery. But these details are commonly agreed to be later fabrications. But all the remaining crusades failed in their objective to retake Jerusalem. In 1291, the last remaining Crusader fortress in Israel, that of Acca, fell to Turkish forces. There were many negative consequences of the Crusades. The brutality and immoral behaviour of the Crusaders permanently harmed relationships with Muslims and Jews. It also caused a major rift with the Western and Eastern branches of the Church. It also set a pattern of violence through the use of the sword by Christians, which of course was in direct contradiction of the command of Christ in Matthew 26, verse 52. Despite all these negatives, the Catholic Church continues to put a positive spin on the Crusades, and this is from their encyclopedia called The New Advent.
From the outset, the Crusades were defensive wars and checked the advance of the Mohammedans, who, for 2 centuries, concentrated their forces in a struggle against the Christian settlements in Syria. Hence, Europe is largely indebted to the Crusades for the maintenance of its independence. Besides, the Crusades brought about results of which the popes had never dreamed, and which were perhaps the most important of all. They re-established traffic between the East and West, which, after having been suspended for several centuries, was then resumed with even greater energy. If, indeed, the Christian civilization of Europe has become universal culture, in the highest sense, the glory redounds in no small measure to the Crusades.
There were other crusades. The Northern Crusades, or Baltic Crusades, were also religious wars undertaken by the Catholic Christian military orders and Catholic kingdoms, primarily against pagan Baltic, Finnic and West Slavic people around the southern and eastern shores of the Baltic Sea, but also, and perhaps to a lesser extent, against Orthodox Christian Slavs. The most notable campaigns were the Livonian and Prussian Crusades. Some of these wars were called Crusades during the Middle Ages, but others, including most of the Swedish ones, were dubbed Crusades later in the 19th century. Whatever, these crusades against northern pagans were authorised by Pope Alexander III in the year 1171 or 72. Pope Alexander III's bull, Non Parum Animus Noster, stated,
"We are deeply distressed and greatly worried when we hear that the savage Estonians and other pagans in those parts rise and fight God's faithful and those who labor for the Christian faith and fight the virtue of the Christian name. To gird yourselves, armed with celestial weapons and the strength of apostolic exhortations, to defend the truth of the Christian faith bravely and to expand the Christian faith forcefully."
Alexander's bull further promised, quote, "a year's remission of sins to all those who fought against the pagans in this conflict. And further, those who died in this crusade would receive a full remission of, quote, all their sins." Unlike the Crusades in the Holy Land and in Iberia, which were understood to be a struggle against Islam, the Northern Crusades were what has been called indirect missionary wars. Their purpose was to create the conditions necessary for the subsequent evangelization of the pagan Baltic region. There was also an attempt to conquer Orthodox Russia. This was led by the Teutonic Order, and it was endorsed by Pope Gregory IX. The attempt to defeat the Russians was halted at the so-called Battle on the Ice in 1242. So-called because the opposing forces met on the frozen Lake Peipus, which today lies on the border of Estonia and Russia. While many so-called Christians were attacking and killing Muslims, there were others who had a different approach. Raymon Llull, or in English, Raymond Lull, was born on the small island of Majorca off the coast of Spain around the year 1232. Majorca had been under Muslim rule between the years 902 to 1229. It was in the year 1229 that the island came under the rule of James I, the King of Aragon, after the city of Palma was taken by his forces after a long siege. Ramon's parents were among those who had come with James I in his conquest of the island. His father was a nobleman, and his support of King James brought him wealth and influence. And it was into this world that Ramon was born 3 years later. His home was located in what is today called the Placa Major in the important city of Palma. Today, a plaque acknowledges the site. It was then, as it is today, an important location, a short walk from the Almudena Palace. And Ramon grew up watching the magnificent La Seu Cathedral being constructed. Because Ramon's parents were wealthy, Ramon enjoyed a life of wealth and privilege. He was clever, and as a young adult he became well known as both a poet and courtier. He eventually became steward to the royal household in the Almudena Palace. He was devoted to seeking the pleasures of life, and despite being married, was a noted womanizer. But then around the year 1263, when he was about 30 years of age, an event took place that changed his life. He wrote about this in the third person in his autobiography, which was written towards the end of his life.
Ramon, while still a young man, was very given to composing worthless songs and poems and to doing other licentious things. One night, he was sitting beside his bed, about to compose and write in his vulgar tongue a song to a lady whom he loved with a foolish love. And as he began to write this song, he looked to his right and saw our Lord Jesus Christ on the cross, as if suspended in midair.
Ramon was terrified and overwhelmed. He immediately threw down his pen and paper and he hid within his bed. He shut his eyes and he earnestly prayed to the Lord for mercy. This was the first of 5 visions in all, and as a result, he dramatically changed the direction of his life. In his autobiography, he said,
I had a wife and children. I was tolerably rich. I led a secular life. All these things I cheerfully resigned for the sake of promoting the common good and diffusing abroad the holy faith.
His comment about diffusing abroad the holy faith meant that he had a conviction that he should reach the Muslims, many of whom still lived in Majorca, as also did a Jewish population. Selling almost all of his possessions and forsaking married life, Ramon then went on a pilgrimage, visiting such holy sites as Rocamadour in southern France. When he returned to Majorca, he bought a Muslim slave with the intention of learning Arabic. This lasted for about 9 years, but on one occasion the slave blasphemed Christ's name, and in response, Ramon struck him a number of times. Later, the slave retaliated and Ramon was hit. For this, the slave was imprisoned. His slave now faced the death penalty, and Ramon was faced with the moral dilemma. Should he pursue the execution of his slave, or should he be forgiving? However, the decision was taken out of his hands when his slave took his own life while in prison. Shortly after this, around the year 1274, Ramonda left the comforts of Palma and began to live a contemplative life on Randa Peak. However, it should be noted that he did keep a small portion of his property, which he set aside to support his wife and children. He lived in this cave for 8 or 9 weeks, where he further developed his ideas. During this time of contemplation, the desire grew to become an apologist for the Christian faith among the Muslims. He realised that the Crusades were no way to draw Muslims into the love of God. With his ideas becoming more crystallised, they would eventually be written down in arguably his most important work, the Ars Magna, or the Great Art, which was written and added to over the following decades. It was an apologetic work, aiming to prove statements about God and creation, such as to prove the Trinity, for example. Raymond emphasised the importance of God's love in Christianity. He argued that the Christian faith is superior to other religions because of the incarnation. It is through the incarnation that we truly see God's love.
If Muslims, according to their law, affirm that God loved man because he created him, endowed him with noble faculties, and pours his benefits upon him, then the Christians, according to their law, affirm the same. But inasmuch as the Christians believe more than this and affirm that God so loved man that he was willing to become man, to endure poverty, ignominy, torture, and death for his sake, which the Jews and Saracens, that is Muslims, do not teach concerning him, therefore, is the religion of the Christians, which thus reveals a love beyond all other love, superior to that of those which reveals it only in an inferior degree.
Islam, he argued in contrast, was a loveless religion, and he believed that love could conquer it. He said that because the Quran denied the incarnation, Muslims remained ignorant of the true character not only of the Godhead, but of God himself.
In the person of Christ, God displays the true union of the Creator and the creature, while in his passion, which he underwent out of his great love for man, it sets forth the divine harmony of infinite goodness and condescension, even the condescension of him who for us men and our salvation and restitution to our primeval state of perfection underwent those sufferings and lived and died for man.
As a result of his decision after this time of contemplation, he garnered support, and under the protection and patronage of King James II, in 1276, he formed the community known as Miramar. His community was located along the rugged coastline of Valdemosa, in the Tramontana Mountains. His aim was to train missionaries at the school at Miramar. There, they would learn Arabic and his Ars Magna in order to be prepared to preach to Muslims in distant lands. He believed that by studying the language and literature of Islam, it would help in refuting the errors made by Muhammad. He himself learnt Arabic and studied the Quran and Islamic beliefs while living in Spain. Eventually, the teaching of Arabic was taken up by the principal universities in the West. He began first working amongst Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula, today part of Spain and Portugal. In this quote, we see his desire to do the work of God.
As a hungry man makes dispatch and takes large morsels on account of his great hunger, so thy servant feels a great desire to die that he may glorify thee. He hurries day and night to complete his work in order that he may give up his blood and his tears to be shed for thee.
Around the year 1291, he prepared to make his first missionary trip to the Muslim city of Tunis in North Africa. He was already, at this stage, in his mid-50s. It was also in the year 1291 that the city of Akko in Israel, with the last Crusader stronghold there, fell to the Muslims. So the Crusades were over, and the Crusaders had been defeated. Now Ramon was at the port of Genoa. His books were already on board the ship, and it was near time to depart. But then a change came over him. He became overwhelmed with terror at the thought of what might befall him in the country where he was going. He thought about the possibility of torture or of lifelong imprisonment. However, he overcame his fears. He boarded the ship and he sailed to Tunis. Raymond's missionary method was to engage in public discussions and to challenge his Muslim listeners. On arriving at Tunis, his first step was to invite the Muslim literati to a conference. He announced that he'd studied the arguments on both sides and was willing to submit the evidence for the Christian faith. He even promised that if he was convinced, he would embrace Islam. The Muslim leaders responded to the challenge and came in large numbers to this conference. He disputed the truth of the Quran in their midst and was an example of moral courage at this time, and his work did have some impact and a small group of believers resulted. However, one imam pointed out to the Sultan there that it was dangerous that such a zealous teacher was allowed to freely expose the errors of Islam, and he suggested that Lull be imprisoned and put to death. So this is what happened. However, he was saved by the intercession of a less prejudiced imam. This imam praised Lull's intellectual ability, and he reminded the Sultan that a Muslim who imitated this same self-devotion of the prisoner in preaching Islam would be highly honoured. His opponents were so impressed by the devotion and courage of Raymond that his punishment of imprisonment was changed to banishment. He was placed aboard a ship, the same which had conveyed him to Tunis and which was now ready to return to Genoa. And he was warned that if he ever returned, he would certainly be stoned to death. Yet he wasn't prepared to submit. He didn't want to leave his small group of converts without instruction or leadership. So he secretly managed to escape from the ship and returned unawares to the harbour town of La Goulette in defiance of the order. For the next 3 months, he concealed himself and continued to witness quietly. He then left and went to Naples, where for several years he taught and lectured on his so-called new method of reaching Muslims. Between the years 1301 to 1309, he went on other missionary journeys. He went to Cyprus, Syria, and Armenia. In spite of obstacles, he said that he resolved to travel from place to place and preach wherever he might have the opportunity. He laboured in the territory of Armenia for more than a year, mostly in the city of Ayas, and it was there that he wrote his book, The Things Which a Man Ought to Believe Concerning God. Then he made a second trip to North Africa, this time going to the city of Bugia. Today, Bugia or Bijaya is part of Algeria. Again, he engaged in public proclamation. Speaking in Arabic, he was able to say that Christianity was the only true faith, and he was willing to prove this to everyone's satisfaction. There were many there that were ready to assault him. However, a mufti, or the chief of the Muslim clergy, rescued him and told him off, particularly for his madness in exposing himself to such danger. Raymond apparently responded and said,
Death has no terrors whatever for a sincere servant of Christ who is labouring to bring souls to a knowledge of truth.
Once again, he was imprisoned. While there, he was helped by some merchants from Genoa and Spain, and it's said that he was also visited by Muslims who urged him to apostatize. Apparently, he was promised wealth and wives if he became a Muslim. Writing from prison, he responded,
You have for me wives and all sorts of worldly pleasure if I accept the law of Mohammed. Alas, you offer a poor price, as all your earthly goods cannot purchase eternal glory. I, however, promise you, if you will forsake your false and devilish law, which was spread by sword and force alone, and if you accept my belief, eternal life, for the Christian faith was propagated by preaching and by the blood of holy martyrs. Therefore, I advise you to become Christians even now, and so obtain everlasting glory and escape the pains of hell.
It was while in prison that Raymond also proposed that both parties should write a defence of their separate faiths. After being imprisoned for 18 months, Ramon was suddenly released, and he went back to Europe. He was in his late 70s when he arrived in Paris, and it was while there in 1311 that Ramon dictated his autobiography. It was called A Contemporary Life, and in it he reflected on his life's journey.
I have, for the sake of the faith, been cast into prison and scourged. I have labored 45 years to gain over the shepherds of the church and the princes of Europe to the common good of Christendom. Now I am old and poor, but still I am intent on the same object. I will persevere in it till death, if the Lord permits it.
Then in 1315, Ramon made his final trip to North Africa. He was now in his early 80s when he arrived at the city of Tripoli, located today in the modern nation of Libya. After arriving at Tripoli, he once again took up public disputation. However, this time he was stoned by a group of angry Muslims. As a result of the wounds he had received, he either died at the scene or perhaps later while on board the boat on its way back to Europe. His body was then taken back to his hometown of Palma, where his grave can be located today. Today, a statue of Raymond Lull can be seen on the island of Majorca. In contrast to the Crusaders who killed their enemies, Raymond Lull lived out Christ's command to love them and to pray for those who persecuted him. He was a great man of courage who spoke of God's love through the incarnation of Christ, and he's left a wonderful legacy for us to follow in this day when we try to discern how to relate to those of the Islamic faith. This is the end of this video, and in our next we'll be examining a significant movement known as scholasticism. Now, the scholastics were men who emphasised human reason along with scripture in order to understand God. Now, significant scholastics included Anselm and Peter Abelard. There was also at this time the increasing influence of another movement, broadly labelled as Christian mysticism. And this movement included Bernard of Clairvaux and Hildegard of Bingen. We'll also note those who wanted a moral reform of the church, and these included Arnold of Brescia. And in addition, there were those who were beginning to question some of the church's teaching, and among their number was Peter Waldo.